Every August, the carnival came to Sunder. For 1 week near the end of the summer, the field outside town filled with rides, game booths, and strings of lights that could be seen long after sunset. It arrived just as the days had begun growing shorter, in that narrow stretch of summer when school was close enough to think about, but still far enough away to ignore. For Danny Walsh and Sean Mercer, the carnival had been part of the end of the summer for as long as either could remember. They had gone together as children, first with their parents and later on their own. As they grew older, the rides mattered less. They stopped wasting money trying to win prizes neither of them wanted. Eventually, they became old enough that spending an entire night at a carnival should probably have felt childish. They went anyway. Whatever else changed during the year, they always came back to it together. The last time was the summer they were 17. That year, Sean went into the House of Mirrors and never came out. By then, Danny and Sean were still best friends, mostly because neither had ever said they weren't. There'd been no falling out between them. Nothing had happened that either could have pointed to as the reason. Their lives had begun moving apart in smaller ways. Danny spent most of his time with people from school. Basketball had given him a larger circle of friends, and with it came practices, weekend plans, and invitations that rarely included Sean. Sean had found his own crowd. He worked several evenings a week at a hardware store near the center of town and spent time with people Danny knew well enough to recognize, but not well enough to call friends. A year earlier, none of it had seemed important. That summer, it did. They could go a week without seeing each other now, sometimes longer. Conversations that once lasted an afternoon had become brief encounters outside stores or a few words exchanged when one happened to pass the other's house. Neither complained about it. Complaining would have required admitting that something had changed. The carnival was different. They had never made plans for it, and they didn't need to. By the first week of August, one of them would mention seeing the trucks near the recreation field, and that was enough. There was one attraction in particular they never skipped. The House of Mirrors had frightened Sean when they were boys. The first time Danny persuaded him to go inside, Sean followed so closely that he stepped on the back of Danny's shoes twice before they reached the exit. For years afterwards, Danny reminded him of it whenever they passed the entrance. Sean eventually stopped being afraid. Danny never stopped reminding him. By 17, the story had become one of those jokes whose beginning neither of them thought about anymore. Every August, they went through the House of Mirrors. Danny would ask Sean if he needed him to go first. Sean would tell him to shut up. Then they would go inside. That year, the carnival opened on Thursday. By Friday night, Danny was already there. He had gone with 3 friends from school, and Sean wasn't one of them. Danny thought about that only once, when they passed the House of Mirrors on the way toward the midway. One of his friends suggested going in. Danny looked at the entrance. Not that one. His friend asked why. Danny didn't have an answer that wouldn't have seemed ridiculous. It's terrible, he said. They kept walking. The following afternoon, Danny saw Sean outside the convenience store near the center of Sunder. Sean had just finished work. He still wore the dark green shirt from the hardware store, the sleeves rolled once above his elbows. He glanced at the carnival wristband Danny hadn't bothered removing from the night before. You went? Danny looked down at it. Yeah. Sean nodded. There was nothing accusatory in the way he did it. That somehow made Danny feel more defensive. A bunch of us went after practice. I figured, Sean said. Danny waited, then Sean looked across the street. For several seconds, neither of them said anything. It was an unfamiliar silence. Not uncomfortable, exactly. Just new. You going again tonight? Sean asked. Danny shrugged. Probably. Sean nodded again. Then he looked at him. What about tomorrow? Danny knew what he meant. For the first time since they were children, the carnival had arrived without the two of them arriving together. Yeah, Danny said. Tomorrow. Sean started toward the parking lot. 8 o'clock? 8 o'clock. Sean raised a hand without turning around. Danny watched him go. Sunday evening, Danny reached the carnival a few minutes before 8. He waited near the entrance while families moved past them toward the midway. Somewhere beyond the ticket booths, a ride started up, followed by a loud burst of music. At 8:07, Sean appeared at the far end of the parking lot. Danny saw him and smiled. Sean smiled back. For a moment, at least, Nothing between them seemed different. Then they went inside together, and for the last time, the carnival belonged to both of them. For the first half hour, neither of them mentioned Friday night. Danny had expected Sean to. He had prepared explanations without realizing he was doing it. The invitation had come after practice. Sean usually worked Fridays. There had been no plan to go without him. None of those explanations were necessary. Sean walked beside him through the midway as though the wristband outside the convenience store had never existed. They stopped first at the game they had been playing since they were 12. 6 glass bottles stood in a pyramid at the back of the booth. 3 softballs cost $5, which Sean pointed out was nearly twice what they used to pay. Danny handed over the money. His first throw struck the center bottle and bounced harmlessly away. Sean laughed. "Rigged. You missed." "I hit it," he said. "Then I guess you lost differently." Danny handed him the next ball. Sean missed everything. For several seconds, Danny couldn't stop laughing. Sean took the last ball from him before he could throw it himself. Not a word. That only made it worse. It was the first moment all night that felt completely familiar. They stayed at the booth longer than they needed to, arguing over which one of them had been worse. From there, they moved through the carnival without much of a plan. They rode 2 rides neither particularly liked anymore because they had always ridden them. Sean bought fried dough and complained about the price. Danny ate half of it anyway. At a shooting game farther down the midway, Sean won a small stuffed bear and handed it to a little girl standing nearby with her father. Danny told him he would have taken it. Sean said that was precisely why he hadn't offered. Little by little, the awkwardness disappeared. The carnival had changed since they were children, though not enough to matter. Some of the rides were newer. Booths had moved. Old painted signs had been replaced by brighter ones. Danny and Sean still knew the place without thinking about it. They knew which games were nearly impossible to win. They knew where rainwater collected near the Ferris wheel. They remembered which ride had made Sean sick, and the bench where Danny had waited beside him afterward, laughing till Sean threatened to leave him there. Danny had spent Friday night at the carnival with some people who knew none of those things. He began to understand why Sunday felt different. Near 9, they sat along a wooden railing at the edge of the midway with paper cups of lemonade between them. From there, most of the carnival was visible. The Ferris wheel turned above the field, its lights changing slowly enough to wash the nearby booths in one color before moving to the next. Sean watched it for a while. "You ever think this place got smaller?" Danny looked across the field. "We got bigger." Sean smiled. "Yeah, that's probably it." They sat without speaking. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. Not yet. A few minutes later, several people from Danny's school passed in front of them. One of the girls stopped when she saw him. She told Danny they'd been looking for him, that everyone was heading to Ryan's house after the carnival. She asked if he was coming. Danny hesitated before saying maybe. It lasted only a second. Sean had noticed. After the group moved on, he continued looking toward the Ferris wheel. "You can go," he said. Danny knew he wasn't talking about that moment. He told Sean he wasn't planning to leave. Sean said he hadn't accused him of anything. The awkwardness Danny thought they had left behind him returned almost immediately. For a while, neither spoke. Danny finally asked Sean if he was still bothered about Friday. Sean looked down at the lemonade in his hands. "Yeah, a little." It was the first honest answer either of them had ever given about it. Sean explained that he didn't care who Danny went with. He didn't even care that Danny had gone without him. What bothered him was that Danny had done it without thinking about him at all. For years, neither of them had needed to ask about the carnival. It was one of the few things that had survived every change between them. Friday night had made Sean realize that perhaps it hadn't survived at all. Danny became defensive. He reminded Sean that they barely saw each other anymore. Sean worked. Danny had basketball. Both of them had other friends. They couldn't expect everything to remain the way it had been when they were kids. Sean agreed. "Not like before," Danny said quietly. "I know," Sean replied. Neither of them looked at each other. For a while, they sat watching shoes pass along the midway, waiting for whichever one of them decided to speak first. Sean eventually stood. Danny thought he was leaving. Instead, Sean tossed his cup into a nearby barrel and waited. Danny finished his lemonade and stood beside him. Nothing had been resolved. Maybe there was nothing to resolve. Neither had done anything wrong. That was what made the distance between them difficult to understand. There was no apology that could return them to something neither had deliberately ended. They began walking again, and for several minutes neither of them spoke. Then Sean pointed out a man carrying an enormous stuffed dog that was nearly as tall as a woman walking beside him. Danny said the man would regret winning it before he reached the parking lot. Sean laughed, and the tension loosened. Not completely, but enough. They crossed beneath the Ferris wheel and continued toward the old end of the carnival, where the lights were farther apart and the attractions had changed less over the years. Sean slowed. Danny noticed and followed his gaze. At the end of the row stood a familiar silver front, reflecting the lights of the midway and long distorted bands. The House of Mirrors. Danny looked at Sean. For the first time that night, neither of them had to ask where they were going. Sean reached the attraction before Danny. It looked almost exactly as it had the year before. Its front was made from narrow mirrored panels arranged around a painted entrance, and each bending them midway into a different shape. People passing behind Danny appeared impossibly tall on one panel, and nearly twice their width on the next. Above the entrance, several bulbs in the old sign had burned out. Sean stopped beneath it, and Danny came up beside him. "You need me to go first?" Sean looked at him. There it was. The same question Danny had asked every August since they were 9. Sean usually answered before he finished saying it. This time, he smiled and stepped through the entrance ahead of him. Danny remained outside for a second. "Look at you." Sean raised one hand without turning around and disappeared behind the first mirrored partition. Danny followed. Inside, the noise of the carnival changed immediately. It didn't disappear. The music and machinery remained audible beyond the walls, but everything sounded farther away. Their footsteps became clearer. So did the occasional voices of other people somewhere inside the attraction. The first section was familiar. Tall mirrors stood at slight angles along both sides of a narrow corridor. Danny saw himself approaching from several directions at once. Sean appeared ahead of him, then beside him, then behind him, depending on which surface Danny had looked at. Sean stopped at one that shortened his legs and widened his shoulders. Finally, Danny laughed. They continued. For several minutes, it was exactly what it had always been. They took wrong turns. Sean walked directly into a clear panel and blamed the lighting. Danny reminded him that the transparent walls had existed the previous summer. At one intersection, they separated deliberately, each trying to find the other through the maze of reflections. Danny saw Sean first. He was several panels away, standing with his back to him. Danny moved toward him. Sean moved farther ahead. "Hold up." Sean continued walking. Danny turned left around the mirrored partition. Sean was there, leaning against the wall, waiting for him. Danny stopped. Sean smiled. "What?" Danny looked behind him. The card he had just followed was empty. "I thought you went over there." Sean leaned slightly to see where Danny was looking. "Nope, I've been standing here." Danny looked back. From that angle, he could see 4 versions of himself and 3 of Sean. Farther in, another figure moved across one of the mirrors. Before Danny could say anything, a teenage boy rounded the corner behind them with 2 girls. Sean nodded toward him. It was probably him. Danny looked at the boy and then at the mirrors. Yeah, probably. They kept moving. By the next section, Danny had forgotten about it. The mirrors changed there. Instead of distorting their bodies, they repeated the corridor in a long, clean reflection. The effect made the attraction appear much larger than it was. Every opening seemed to continue into another, and every turn produced another version of the passage they had just left. Sean was several steps ahead now. Danny let him stay there. He could still see him. They turned right, then left, another right. Sean disappeared around the next partition, and Danny followed. The corridor was empty. "Sean?" No answer. Danny smiled. He knew what Sean was doing. "You're 17, he said. He waited for the laugh that usually followed, but nothing came. Danny continued. At the next intersection, the noise from the carnival seemed to fade. Danny stopped. The music was still there, buried somewhere beyond the walls, but the rides and voices had become difficult to separate from the low mechanical hum surrounding the attraction. His own footsteps were louder now. Danny turned left. The corridor ended at a mirror. His reflection walked toward him until he stopped inches from the glass. Very fun, he thought. He turned back. For the first time, Danny realized he could no longer hear Sean moving ahead of him. He retraced his steps and took another direction. His shoes struck the floor in a steady rhythm, and then Danny stopped. A final step seemed to fall somewhere ahead. He remained still, but nothing followed. Danny listened for several seconds before moving again. Old walls, hollow flooring, too many hard surfaces. Sound traveled strangely in places like this. He continued. At the next intersection, mirrors faced one another across a narrow passage, repeating Danny farther into the attraction than he could count. For a moment, there seemed to be someone else among them. A dark shirt, the back of a head. Danny turned toward it. There was nobody there. When he looked into the mirror again, there was only himself. Sean? His voice traveled through the corridors. There was no answer. The smile had left Danny's face. He walked faster. Another turn, another empty passage. It occurred to him that he hadn't seen anyone else in there since the boy and two girls near the entrance. A few minutes earlier, he had been able to hear people somewhere around them. Now he couldn't. Even the carnival outside seemed farther away. Danny stopped at another intersection. 3 directions. Each looked almost identical. For the first time since they were children, he understood why Sean had once hated this place. There was no reliable way of telling where anything was. Every corridor appeared longer than it could have been. Every movement at the edge of his vision seemed to belong to someone until he looked directly at it. Danny chose the passage to his right. Sean? He asked again. Nothing. He turned another corner. Sean was standing at the opposite end. Danny stopped. The relief came quickly enough to annoy him. There you are. Sean stared at him. He didn't look amused. Where'd you go? Danny almost laughed. Me? Sean nodded. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Danny looked back over his shoulder at the corridor he had come through. Then Sean did the same. Neither seemed quite sure what he expected to find. I thought you were messing with me, Danny said. Sean shook his head. I thought you were. The carnival music could be heard again. Faintly. Neither of them laughed. Neither suggested continuing through the maze. Sean looked toward the faint carnival music, and Danny followed his gaze. Without discussing it, they began trying to find their way out. Sean took the lead. At first, Danny stayed close behind him. They moved more quickly than before, no longer stopping at the distorted mirrors or trying to confuse each other with the intersections. Whatever had happened when they lost each other, both seemed willing to blame it on the maze as long as they could put the maze behind them. Sean turned left at the next opening, and Danny followed him. For several seconds, the carnival grew louder. Music rose somewhere beyond the walls, accompanied by the mechanical rhythm of one of the rides and the scattered voices of people on the midway. They were heading in the right direction. Sean seemed to hear it too. He picked up his pace. At the next intersection, Danny watched him turn right and followed. 3 steps later, he reached a mirror. Danny stopped. Sean's reflection disappeared from the glass. He backed up and found the actual passage several feet away. But by the time he reached it, Sean was already farther ahead. Danny hurried after him. From there, the mirrors began costing him a few seconds at a time. A clear panel stopped him where he expected an opening. At another intersection, several reflections of Sean moved ahead at different angles. Danny chose one, realized his mistake, and doubled back. Each time he corrected himself, Sean was a little farther away. Hold up. Sean glanced back. He slowed long enough for Danny to close some of the distance between them. Then they heard the sounds again, louder this time. Sean turned toward the sound, and Danny followed. The corridor narrowed ahead, mirrors lining both sides. Sean multiplied across as he moved. Danny kept his attention on the center of his back, refusing to let another reflection pull his eyes away. For a while, it worked. Then the passage divided. Sean went left. Danny followed and nearly walked into another clear panel. He caught himself against the glass. Sean was visible on the other side, still moving. Danny backed away, found an opening, and hurried around. Now Sean was farther ahead again. Not too far, 20 feet, maybe less. Close enough that Danny could still see him clearly. Sean reached the end of the corridor and turned right. Danny quickened his pace, and a reflection moved beside him. He looked toward it without thinking. It was another version of Sean. Danny immediately looked ahead. The real one was gone. He reached the corner only seconds later and turned right, and the passage again was empty. Danny didn't stop. Sean had been ahead of him throughout most of the maze. He had probably reached another turn already. Danny continued moving. The next corridor was empty too, and then another. The carnival music grew louder, and Danny followed it. A strip of colored light appeared across the floor ahead, and he moved toward it quickly. Warm night air reached him first, and then the music, then the full noise of the midway. Danny stepped through the exit. For a moment, relief replaced everything else. He expected Sean to be waiting nearby, but he wasn't. Danny looked toward the side of the attraction, then toward the carnival. No Sean. He waited. A couple emerged from the exit behind him, laughing as they walked away. Then 2 boys came through. A woman followed with a young girl holding her hand. Danny moved aside and continued watching. Sean had been ahead of him. That was the part Danny kept returning to. He had watched him turn the corner. 5 minutes passed. Danny began to wonder if Sean had gone around the entrance looking for him. He walked along the outside of the attraction. The attendant stood near the entrance taking tickets without much interest in the people handing them over. "Is my friend still in there?" The attendant glanced at the maze. "Probably." Danny looked past him. People continued entering. He returned to the exit, and another group came through. Then another. Sean wasn't with them. 10 minutes had passed now. Danny stood a few feet from the exit, watching every person who emerged. The irritation he felt inside the maze was gone. So was the certainty that Sean was somewhere ahead of him. Another pair of people stepped through the exit. Danny looked past them into the narrow corridor beyond. Nobody followed. He waited. More people eventually came out. None of them were Sean. Danny left the House of Mirrors and began searching the carnival. Sean had left ahead of him. The most reasonable explanation was that he had gotten out first and wandered back toward the midway. Danny checked the area around the Ferris wheel, then the railing where they had sat earlier. From there, he worked his way through the crowd, looking toward the game booths and food stands as he passed. Sean wasn't at any of them. He checked near the restrooms, then doubled back toward the other side of the carnival. Twice he changed direction after spotting someone he thought was Sean, only to realize as he got closer that he was mistaken. The carnival was still crowded. Danny worked his way through it, checking the places they had already been and scanning the faces passing in both directions. Near the Ferris wheel, someone called his name. It was the group from school he had seen earlier. They were heading toward the exit now, still talking about the party. One of the girls asked if he was coming. Danny barely slowed. "Have you seen Sean?" She shook her head, and Danny kept walking. He made another pass through the carnival, and then another. By the time he returned to the House of Mirrors, nearly 20 minutes had passed. The same attendant was still at the entrance. "My friend hasn't come out?" The man recognized Danny from before. This time, Danny explained that he had searched the carnival and couldn't find him anywhere. They had entered the attraction together. Sean had made it ahead of him inside, and Danny had seen him only minutes before reaching the exit. The attendant listened more carefully now. He called another worker over, and they went inside. Danny waited near the entrance, and several people emerged while workers were searching. Sean was not among them. A few minutes later, the workers returned alone. Then they went in again. This time, the attraction stopped admitting people. Those who were still inside were brought out. Workers checked the corridors, behind the mirror panels and through the narrow service spaces surrounding the maze. But they found nothing. By then, there was no longer any reason to believe Sean had simply gotten turned around. The search moved beyond the House of Mirrors, then beyond the carnival. Sean's parents arrived. The police came. Workers checked beneath rides and behind booths while others searched the edges of the recreation grounds. The carnival shut down. The music stopped first, and then the rides. Danny stood beneath the midway lights as the place he and Sean had known their entire lives became the most unrecognizable without the movement and noise. The search continued through the night. Danny stayed with it. By morning, people were searching the streets surrounding the carnival and the areas beyond the recreation grounds. There was no sign of Sean. The search continued the following day, then through the week. The carnival left Sunder. Sean never came home. Weeks became months. There were reported sightings, but none led anywhere. Areas already searched were searched again. Posters remained in store windows long after the carnival field had been cleared. Nothing belonging to Sean was ever found. No one remembered seeing him leave the carnival, and nothing Danny told anyone changed the last thing he knew for certain. Sean had been ahead of him. Danny had watched him turn a corner, and seconds later he was gone. Summer ended. Danny returned to school. As the months passed, Sean's parents began leaving their porch light on at night, hoping he might still find his way home. Danny noticed it whenever he passed their house. Winter came, and then spring. Sean remained missing. By the following August, the field outside Sunder was empty only until the trucks arrived. Danny saw the first of them one morning on his way through town. By afternoon, sections of painted metal lay across the grass. Over the next several days, the familiar shapes began rising again. The booths, the rides, the Ferris wheel. And eventually, at the old end of the midway, the House of Mirrors. Exactly where it had been the year before. The carnival returned to Sunder every August. For several years, Danny stayed away. He remained in town. Life moved forward, though certain things changed more slowly than others. Sean's parents still lived in the same house, and whenever Danny happened to pass by at night, the porch light was on. 9 years after Sean disappeared, Danny went back to the carnival. He hadn't planned to. He drove past the recreation field one evening, saw the Ferris wheel turning above the midway, and continued for several blocks before turning around. The carnival looked smaller than he remembered. Sean had said that once. Danny walked to the midway without stopping. Some of the attractions had changed, others were exactly where he remembered them. So was the House of Mirrors. Danny stood outside of it for several minutes. Then he bought a ticket. Inside, the carnival noise faded behind him. The corridor seemed narrower than he remembered. The mirrors were scratched in places, their edges easier to see now than they had been when he was 17. Danny moved through them slowly. Then someone crossed the reflection ahead of him. A young man. Danny stopped. He saw only the back of him before the figure disappeared around a turn. Brown hair, dark shirt. Danny remained where he was. 9 years had passed. He continued toward the exit. At the next intersection, he saw the young man again, farther ahead. Danny slowed. The figure crossed between two mirrors and disappeared. Danny followed him. He told himself there were hundreds of people at the carnival. There was nothing unusual about a teenager with dark hair wearing a dark shirt. Then he saw him again. Same build, same hair. About the same age Sean had been that night. Danny stopped trying to explain it, but he followed. The young man remained ahead of him, appearing briefly between panels before disappearing again. Danny began moving faster. The distance between them narrowed. At the end of the next corridor, the young man turned right. Danny hurried toward it and then stopped. The corner was only a few feet away. 9 years earlier, Danny had watched Sean turn a corner just like it. He had followed, but there had been nobody there. Danny stared at the opening. The young man did not come back. Danny never looked around the corner. After a while, he backed away and found another route through the maze. When he stepped outside, the carnival continued around him as though nothing had happened. Danny left. He never entered the House of Mirrors again. 9 years earlier, Sean Mercer had disappeared somewhere beyond a turn Danny had been seconds too late to reach. This time, Danny reached the corner. He chose not to see what was on the other side.